Inside of a concentration camp, the eldest son of Joseph Stalin would die under very strange and disputed circumstances. He was a man who had made a lot of enemies during his imprisonment, but he would ultimately be condemned by the ruthlessness and unforgiving nature of his father, the dictator of the Soviet Union. Stalin had a chance to save his son, but he would not do this and would not give in. Stalin was the leader of the Union from 1924 until his death in 1953, and during his time in power he would oversee the Red Army and would rule during the deadliest conflict in history, the Second World War. He would ultimately, despite huge losses, taste victory in the defeat of Nazism and Adolf Hitler. To begin with, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had drawn up a pact and a non-aggression agreement between the two nations, but then Hitler would look towards the east and he would want to take as much of Stalin's lands as he could. This resulted in some of the bloodiest battles in human history and the deadliest sieges, such as Leningrad, with towns and cities such as Stalingrad becoming huge strongholds and places of huge importance. But Hitler would manage to capture Stalin, and his German forces would hold Yakov Dzhugashvili in their custody, the eldest son of Joseph Stalin. But as predicted, Stalin would be furious that his own son would fall into the hands of his enemies, and he could never forgive this. Join us today as we look at the ruthless execution of the son of Stalin, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 31st of March 1907, Yakov Dzhugashvili was born to his mother, Katis Zvandish, and his father, who would then be known as Joseph Dzhugashvili, the later Joseph Stalin. His father would call him Patsana, but the family were forced to move whilst the boy was young, due to his father being involved in the bank robbery, and the family then sought refuge in Baku, all whilst Stalin tried to avoid arrest. They lived in a small house, and they then returned following the death of Yakov's mother, who succumbed to typhus on the 5th of December 1907. This left Stalin with his young son alone, but then Stalin looked for others to raise his son, and he left him to be raised by his wife's family, and he would be very distant. For 14 years Yakov was raised by his aunts, before his father then summoned him to live in Moscow. He did not understand Russian, and because of this he could not understand his own father, and this life was very unfamiliar for the young boy. Stalin did not look after him, and he would sleep in the dining room of his father's apartments, and his father also banned him from taking the surname Stalin. But despite this, Yakov was seen as a kind and nice-natured young man. Following a few years with his father, he then attended university, and he would graduate as an engineer from the Institute of Transport, and he then worked inside of an electric plant factory. But in 1937 he wanted a career in the armed forces, and Yakov began to train in the artillery academy. But his relationship with his father was incredibly strained, as in the decade previous, Yakov had asked to marry the daughter of a priest, but his father refused this, and this rejection led to Yakov trying to take his own life, and he would miss his heart with a gunshot by only a small amount, and he was nearly killed. He did have a number of girlfriends, and he would later get married, but as the Second World War broke out, it was obvious to many that Hitler would one day turn his Wehrmacht and military towards the Soviet Union. The Nazis ideologically hated the communists and Bolsheviks, and they wanted to eradicate communism forever. But the invasion of the Soviet Union occurred in June 1941, as Operation Barbarossa was launched. This was the largest land invasion in human history, and the eastern front of the Second World War was opened up, and with this there was a huge amount of bloodshed. Millions died for Stalin's cause, and they tried to repel the might of the German army. But the Wehrmacht rampaged into Soviet lands, and Stalin was forced to accept that the Germans could very well have taken the majority of his country. To begin with, he could not believe that he had been crossed, but he then forced his son onto the front lines of the conflict. Yakov, who had remained in an artillery division, was a lieutenant within the 14th Howitzer Regiment of the 14th Tank Division, but he would be captured rather quickly. Following a month after the initial invasion of the Soviet Union, the son of Stalin was captured during the Battle of Smolensk. The Germans would overwhelm the artillery battery where Yakov was based, and despite the order being given to retreat, Yakov disobeyed this, and he exclaimed, "I am the son of Stalin, and I do not allow the battery to retreat." But some historians have claimed that people betrayed Yakov, and that his position was fed to the Germans, as some Soviets had become rather dissident to Stalin's regime. Stalin was outraged that his son had been captured, and he wanted his son to take his own life, rather than to fall into the hands of his enemies. Yakov Dzhugashvili had to begin with taken off his officer badges, but he would be recognised, and then he was interrogated by the Abwehr. And when he was interviewed, he said how the Red Army were not prepared for a war, and he spoke against his father's war effort. He conceded that the Germans were militarily superior at the time in the war, and the Germans then confirmed his identity, and then Joseph Goebbels turned the propaganda efforts up to shame the Soviets and to hurt Stalin. There were leaflets produced, and these were dropped over Soviet soldiers, that showed Stalin's son smiling with the enemy, and the leaflet said, "Dear father, I have been taken prisoner. I am in good health. I will be soon sent to a camp for officers in Germany. I am being treated well. I wish you good health." The Soviets would hit back, and they tried to spin Yakov's actions during the Battle of Smolensk, and they awarded him with the Order of the Red Banner for his actions during the fighting. But Stalin's son was then sent back to Germany, and specifically to Berlin, to the heart of Hitler's government. Goebbels had planned to force him to make a broadcast over the radio, but this never took place, and he was then sent to Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp. Sachsenhausen was a notorious concentration camp, and it was set up in 1936, and it would hold prisoners who were classified as political prisoners. Throughout its time in operation, around 200,000 prisoners passed through the gates of the camp, and dozens of prisoners were killed. It was a labour work camp, and there were gas chambers there, and also rooms where medical experimentation would be carried out. The prisoners would be exterminated through labour. They were then treated awfully, and were given very little food, and they were then executed in front of other inmates in cold blood. Yakov Dzhugashvili would be sent there, and he was seen as a celebrity inside of the camp, but he would be targeted also. Visitors tried to see him, however he became very argumentative, and in particular he got into hostility with British prisoners, and would physically fight them at times. But the son of Stalin would remain at the camp for some time, but as the Second World War began to turn against the Germans, there was a prisoner swap offered to free Yakov Dzhugashvili. Following the German surrender of Stalingrad, Stalin's son was offered as a prisoner swap for the captured General Paulus, and Stalin point-blank refused to do this. He refused to exchange his son for a skilled general, and there were other talks regarding freeing Stalin's son. There were talks about swapping Stalin's son for Hitler's nephew, Heinz Hitler, who had also earlier been captured, but this would have been facilitated by the Swedish Red Cross if it had gone ahead. This would have seemingly been a fair swap, especially as Hitler loved his nephew Heinz, but this would be turned down, especially after Heinz would be brutalised and killed inside of a Moscow torture chamber and prison. But things following the refusal to swap would go downhill for Yakov Dzhugashvili. He would die on the 14th of December 1943, and he would die within Sachsenhausen. Stalin did not want anything to do with his son, and he felt let down by him, but there were different accounts of his death. One was that he was killed as he would run into a high-voltage electric fence that surrounded Sachsenhausen, as he could not take any more, and that he had been broken. Bodies were often left on the fence for some time, and this was a possibility. But another account of Stalin's son's death states that he was actually executed by the Germans, when he was said to have been of no use for them. But the British would find records inside of the camp at the end of the war, alluding to the fact that both of these accounts may have been partially true. In a document inside of the German archives, records stated that Yakov Dzhugashvili ran into the electric fence after he had been seen arguing with British prisoners, but it was alleged that to get away from the British he ran into the fence on accident or by purpose. But following this, a German officer then went over to his body and fired an executioner's shot, or a coup de grace gunshot, into Stalin's son's body 4 times to make sure he was in fact dead. But Stalin would mourn his son when he found out about the death of him. He had felt let down and disgraced by him, but in his death his opinions and feelings changed, and he believed that Yakov was a brave man, and he said he had been very unfair to him. When he was told of his son's death, the dictator of the Soviet Union stared at pictures of his eldest son for hours, and he was disconsolate. But Stalin would practically sentence his own son to death by refusing to accept prisoner swaps for him, and he could have saved him easily. He would never have been allowed to leave Sachsenhausen without a prisoner swap, and he would have been executed if nothing was arranged. But the life of Stalin's son is tragic, and it centres mostly around the animosity his father had for him. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.